Josh, you've got a paragraph from the book On Being Certain you want to share.
Before I read this paragraph, I want you guys to think about what I'm saying, and then afterwards I'm going to reread the paragraph and give you a clue to what it is about. A newspaper is better than a magazine. A seashore is a better place than a street. At first, it is better to run than walk. You may have to try several times. It takes some skill, but it is easy to learn. Even young children can enjoy it. Once successful, complications are minimal. Birds seldom get too close. Rain, however, soaks in very fast. Too many people doing the same thing can also cause problems. One needs lots of room. If there are no complications, it can be very peaceful. A rock will serve as an anchor. If things break loose from it, however, you will not get a second chance. Now, at first glance, nothing makes sense. And in fact, when I first read this, there was almost a sense of uneasiness when you're reading this because you're trying to compartmentalize what all these things mean and how they wrap in together. Now let me say one word and repeat the paragraph. A kite. A newspaper is better than a magazine. A seashore is a better place than the street. At first, it is better to run than walk. You may have to try several times. It takes some skill, but it is easy to learn. Even young children can enjoy it. Once successful, complications are minimal. Birds seldom get too close. Rain, however, soaks in very fast. Too many people are doing the same thing can also cause problems. One needs lots of room. If there are no complications, it can be very peaceful. A rock will serve as an anchor. If things break loose from it, however, you will get not a second chance. One word can completely change the entire makeup of how much sense that paragraph makes. And you go from a sense of uneasiness when you first hear the paragraph, not being able to compartmentalize what any of it means, to complete and almost a sense of relief, of certainty, now that you know what the paragraph is about. Justin, what were your initial thoughts of the paragraph? And then how are you feeling after I kind of said what it was about?
It drives home the point of priming. And when I say priming, or context in a sense, once you know that, oh, this is a kite, you have a lens of which to kind of put the pieces together. But without that lens, it remains ambiguous. Your mind's trying to put it together, but it can't quite it can't quite seem to connect the dots. And so, as you say, Josh, there's this tension, there's this unease, there's this malaise that exists saying, okay, well, wait a minute, all this is coming at me. There's some point to this, but I don't yet quite have the point in order to make sense of it all.
Yeah, the name of this channel is confirming your biases. Let's just take the example. Let's just say that your life was like this paragraph, and there was always this uneasy tension, almost anxious feeling because you don't know exactly what you know. And there rises a lot of complications from that.
There was a very good lecture that was given by Viktor Efnemov, apologies if I screwed the name up, to the FSB, which would be the successor to the KGB. And I believe this was before 2002, so the early part of the 2000s. Anyways, he talked about global governance, and he said global governance occurs on 6 priorities, or there's 6 themes in a sense we've got to worry about. For example, Josh, the economy is one. Another example is history. Another example is biological weapons. Warfare. Kinetic warfare would be an example. But the first and most important vector or priority of global governments was perspective. And I think about that, and I think back to something from my childhood that I played when I was growing up, again about this time, which was Metal Gear Solid 2. And at the very end, there's this comment where the ability to create context is incredibly powerful. And so from that quote, Josh, there's no context. That's, the word kite that you mentioned. And so you can get this data that your brain's trying to put together, but it doesn't have the framework in order to do it. But if you give the brain the framework, the context, that is, kite, it's like, oh, all this is talking about how do I secure a kite, how do I launch a kite, how do I manage a kite, etc. And what's also interesting is that once you prime a mind for how to look at something, what the mind seeks, the mind will find. So here's another example for this, but this is more applicable to modern times. If you prime people with the example of, let's say, the West and America is a horrible, evil, institution, and it's founded upon racism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then all of a sudden, people will always jump to that conclusion, or that's how the mind will put it together. Now, a few people might break free from it, but nonetheless, there's that. Bloom's a good example of this from Closing with the American Mind, where Bloom challenged his professors when he himself was a student, saying, well, listen, this teaching of American history, doesn't this just teach us to despise our foundation? And of course, the professors just kind of, blew Bloom off at the point. But the key thing is, I think this gets back to your point, Josh, is once you provide the framework of it, that's what your mind then seeks to find out. And as far as, on being certain, we need certainty, but the ironic thing is that the certainty we often derive, like a meta level, comes from this framework of like what's the perspective we come at it at. So anyways, this goes back into, the entire thing what Victor was talking about with global governance, is that if you can control behind the scenes the framework, that's the word kite, for example. I strongly suspect, although I can't read minds, but this is just kind of an operating assumption I use until I'm proven wrong, that many people do not understand or are aware of this aspect of our nature. But not being aware of it doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't exist. Josh, your thoughts?
Honestly, Justin, I think you just nailed that. Like, I really don't need to add too much.
Here, well, I can share this real quick too. If you search Victor Efimov lecture for FSB former KGB agents, this is, and it's like an hour, it's like 2 hours long, but it's worth it. In that scene from Metal Gear Solid 2 where it's like, we don't propose blah, 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 we propose to create context. Like, when they say that, that's kite is the creation of context in that regard. Or, Josh, you're a white male, how dare you? I mean, like, just look at all the bad things you've done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and it's very easy when I give you that perspective of kite for you to relate every single one of those lines to a kite. But it would also be very easy for somebody, if they wanted to impose a kite-like thought into your mind and frame it against any other thought that you could have, like Justin was just saying, of the evils of the white man, or any of these predeceived thoughts that you have just because you are repetitively told that is the truth. Therefore, why question it?
In any event, Josh, I think what you're seeing the same confluence of ideas, whether it's Bloom, from my perspective, from the closing of the American mind, the closing being the lack of understanding or the willful not wanting to understand that there's this meta layer that we impose upon ourselves to make sense of things. If you grew up gaming in Metal Gear Solid 2, it's the Colonel telling Raiden, we don't seek to control you. We don't seek to censor information. We just seek to create the context. We seek to impose the lenses that you use to process the information, and in doing that, you always will get to the right conclusion. Or as Victor Efimov, and again, apologies for that name, I'm sure I'm butchering it, talking about, the first priority on global governance, which is like, the framework. And while this might be the most subtle thing, so for example, if this is the most powerful, it is also the least imminent, versus the opposite in global governance would be the military. You said the military in somewhere, there's an immediate effect on that, tanks, bullets, etc., dropping bombs, oh boy, does that create, like that, you get something. But at the same time, it's also kind of the least stay. It'll come on quick, but it won't necessarily resound very long. But if you can get it up into the mind, if you can control how the mind perceives things or doesn't perceive things, it might not necessarily be an immediate effect, like, God forbid, like a bullet, gun, bomb, etc. But it's much more, it stays far longer.
How much relief do you feel from that anxiety when you don't know something? That anxious feeling when that strain of sentences finally makes sense. That light bulb moment, it feels good internally. And if people are artificially making that light bulb go off in people's head, there will still be a tension feeling, because deep down people know that they're being lied to. They just don't care enough, because the answer is too easy to almost override.
Yeah, and I'll go a step further. Josh, we just did a video talking about what porn is for men, what social validation, likes from Instagram is for the ladies. That this or like the financialization of the economy, to steal one of Gammon's references, where you basically have the balloon and the basket being inverted. I think the same thing goes true in this regard, is where we desperately want, the certainty, but the cues that we've traditionally used to gain the certainty are being gamed. And I would argue they're being gained by powers that know that they're gaming the system and therefore gaming us, and we haven't quite yet figured it out. Now, sooner or later, you're going to have a come to Jesus moment, as I've said many times before in many other videos. Hopefully you have that come to Jesus moment before, the complete meltdown of the system. In other words, you want to walk just to the edge, be scared enough to, wake up and then pull back. You don't actually want to go over the edge. I mean, you want Minerva's owl to fly before dusk, if you want me to use more fancy schmancy language.
Thank you, and we'll see you in the next one.